3 hours before the cameras roll, Johnny Carson sits in his office at NBC's Burbank studios. The brown paper bag containing his lunch rests on the desk, untouched. He studies a single page, reading the same paragraph over and over. The page describes tonight's guest segment, Joan Embery from the San Diego Zoo, bringing a pygmy marmoset, a king snake, and a domestic goose. Nothing unusual. She had been on the show dozens of times before. The routine was practiced, predictable, safe. Carson folds the page in half, then quarters it, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who spent years performing card tricks to ease tension at parties where he didn't belong. He places the folded paper in his jacket pocket and walks toward the makeup room, where someone will paint on the face America expects to see. No one watching that night would remember the goose or the snake. What they would remember, what would follow Carson for the rest of his life, was something that couldn't be rehearsed, predicted, or controlled. A moment lasting no more than 90 seconds that would crack open the carefully constructed armor he wore every evening at 11:30. The thing about perfection is that it cannot survive contact with the unpredictable. And the thing about Johnny Carson was that he had spent 3 decades trying to prove otherwise. The camera loves Johnny Carson because Johnny Carson has learned to love the camera back, or at least to perform a convincing simulation of affection. By 1977, he has hosted The Tonight Show for 15 years. He knows precisely where to stand, exactly when to pause, how to turn his head to catch the light at the correct angle. He studies tapes of his own performances at home, watching himself with the cold eye of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. "There's Carson the performer, and there's Carson the private individual," he told Mike Wallace once, "and I can separate the two." This separation is not a boast. It is a confession. Off camera, Carson carries a deck of cards in his pocket because hands need something to do when words fail. At parties, he performs magic tricks rather than engage in conversation. Dick Cavett will later say, "I felt sorry for Johnny in that he was so socially uncomfortable. I've hardly ever met anybody who had as hard of a time as he did." But on stage, under lights, behind the desk, there Johnny Carson is in complete control. The audience cannot see his hands shake. They cannot sense the careful calibration of every gesture, the meticulous planning that begins each morning when he wakes and doesn't end until he sleeps. They see only the smooth performance, the easy smile, the perfectly timed pause before the punchline. The Tonight Show runs like a Swiss watch. Carson and his producer, Fred de Cordova, meet every afternoon at 1:05 p.m. They review the guest list, discuss potential problems, identify moments where things might go wrong. Then they build contingencies, backup jokes, alternative transitions, escape routes. Johnny was the most famous person in America, documentary filmmaker Peter Jones will say years later, yet there was something unknowable about him. What was unknowable was this: the performance cost him everything. His lawyer, Henry Bushkin, remembers Sonny Werblin, a powerful entertainment executive, saying, "Jack Benny was the unhappiest man I've ever known, and Benny is Carson's idol. Johnny is the second unhappiest person I've ever known." Carson didn't object to this assessment. He simply sat there, smoking a Pall Mall, acknowledging the truth of it with his silence. The architecture of control requires constant maintenance. Every brick must be mortared perfectly. Every beam must bear its precise weight. One loose stone and the entire structure becomes vulnerable to collapse. Joan Embery represented the loose stone Carson never saw coming. Joan Embery arrives at NBC with 3 carriers and an assistant who looks perpetually concerned. She is young, 28 years old, but moves with the confidence of someone who has stared down lions and remained calm when rhinoceroses charged. The animals trust her because she does not perform anxiety. This is her 30th appearance on The Tonight Show. Perhaps more. She has lost count. The first time in 1971, she brought Carol the elephant. Carson had been uncertain about having live animals on set, worried about the chaos they might introduce. But the segment worked. The audience loved watching Carson react to the unpredictable. He learned to lean into the danger, to let the snake slither up his sleeve, to hold the baby gorilla and look into its eyes with an expression of genuine wonder. These moments made Carson seem human, approachable, capable of surprise, but they were still controlled surprises. The animals were selected carefully. Embery briefed the staff on what to expect. Carson knew the boundaries of the risk he was taking. Tonight, the pygmy marmoset sits in its carrier, no larger than a human hand. It weighs less than 5 ounces. Its eyes are disproportionately huge, making it look perpetually startled. The creature seems harmless, decorative even, a living toy. Embery has a moment of concern before the segment. She knows marmosets are unpredictable climbers. They mark territory, they move fast. But Carson has handled snakes, birds of prey, and infant primates before. He knows how to stay calm. She decides not to mention her concern. The segment will be fine. Backstage, Carson smokes his 4th cigarette of the evening. The monologue went well. The first guest, a television actor promoting a new drama series, was adequate, professional, boring. Now comes the animal segment, the crowd pleaser, the easy material that allows Carson to play the role he perfected, the bemused straight man reacting to nature's inherent comedy. He stubs out the cigarette and walks toward the stage. Ed McMahon is already in position, laughing at something that hasn't happened yet, warming up the audience with his booming, preemptive joy. The applause sign lights. The band plays. Johnny Carson steps into the light. Our next guest, he says, turning toward camera 2 with the precision of a marksman, is a woman who has brought more animals onto this stage than Noah fit on the ark. Please welcome, from the San Diego Zoo, Joan Embery. The audience applauds. Embery walks out, carrying the marmoset in her hands. Everything is going according to plan. The marmoset seems calm at first. Embery explains that pygmy marmosets are the smallest primates in the world, native to the Amazon rainforest. Carson listens with the practiced attention of a man who knows when to nod, when to interject a question, when to lean back and let the guest carry the segment. "Would you like to hold him?" Embery asks. Carson extends his hand. This is the moment the audience waits for, the moment when nature intersects with celebrity, when the untamed briefly touches the choreographed. The marmoset transfers from Embery's palm to Carson's with remarkable ease. It sits for a moment, looking around with those enormous eyes, assessing the studio lights, the cameras, the strange landscape of human attention. Then it begins to climb. Tiny fingers grip Carson's sleeve. The creature moves up his arm with startling speed, ignoring Carson's gentle attempts to guide it back down. It reaches his shoulder, pauses, then continues upward, climbing onto the crown of his head. The audience laughs. This is good television, unscripted, spontaneous. Carson, to his credit, remains still. He doesn't panic. He glances at Embery, a question in his eyes. Is this normal? Embery is caught between 2 instincts. She could reach up, try to retrieve the animal, but Carson seems in control. She lets the moment continue. The marmoset settles on top of Carson's head. It wraps its tail around his ear, a gesture that looks almost affectionate. The audience finds this hilarious. Even Carson begins to smile, recognizing the comedy in the situation. Then the warmth. It takes Carson a moment to understand what is happening. The sensation is subtle at first, a spreading wetness seeping through his carefully styled hair, running down toward his forehead. The marmoset is urinating on him, on live television, in front of 8 million people. The audience erupts. Not polite laughter, but the kind of primal, uncontrollable howling that comes from witnessing something so perfectly absurd that the brain temporarily abandons its duties. Embery tries to explain, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. He's marking his territory. He's content. That's actually a good sign. But no one is listening to her words. They're watching Carson's face. For perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity in television time, Johnny Carson doesn't know what to do. His expression cycles through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, comprehension, disbelief, resignation. The mask slips. The separation between performer and person dissolves. Ed McMahon is doubled over, tears streaming down his face. The cameramen are shaking with suppressed laughter, the image trembling slightly. Even the studio audience has people literally falling out of their seats. Carson reaches up slowly, touches the top of his head, feels the wetness. He looks at his fingers. He looks at Embery. He looks at the camera. And then, remarkably, he laughs. Not the practiced laugh, the one he deploys when a joke lands exactly as expected. This is something different. Raw, unguarded. The laugh of a man who has just realized that all his preparation, all his control, all his careful architecture has been defeated by a creature weighing less than a bar of soap. "Well," Carson says, his voice thick with genuine amusement, "I didn't know you were going to bring me a shower." The line is decent, not his best work, but in this moment, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Johnny Carson, the man who studies his own performances, who separates performer from person, who plans contingencies for every possible disruption, has been surprised into authenticity. Embery finally retrieves the marmoset. A production assistant rushes out with towels. Carson dabs at his hair, still smiling, still shaking his head in disbelief. The segment continues. They move on to the king snake, then the goose. But the energy has shifted. Something has been revealed that cannot be hidden again. After the show, Carson returns to his dressing room. He sits in front of the mirror, looking at himself, at the man whose hair is still damp from a marmoset's territorial marking. George Smith, his houseman, offers him a drink. Carson waves it away. "You know," Carson says to no one in particular, "I spent 15 years making sure nothing like that would ever happen." George says nothing. There's nothing to say. Carson studies his reflection for a long moment. Then he begins to laugh again, quiet this time, almost private. The laugh of a man who has just learned that control is an illusion we tell ourselves to make the chaos bearable. The clip plays on The Tonight Show for years afterward. Johnny brings it up in retrospectives. Guests reference it. Comedians build material around it. The story becomes legendary. The night Johnny Carson was peed on by a monkey on live television. But that's not what the story is about. Joan Embery will later say that Carson's response was what made the moment memorable. His acceptance and his response was so memorable that to this day people will describe that in great detail. It wasn't the incident itself. It was Carson's reaction, the way he surrendered to the absurdity, the way he allowed himself to be human for 90 seconds on national television. Years later, long after Carson retires, long after he disappears into the private life he always craved, people still talk about the marmoset. They don't talk about the thousands of perfectly executed monologues, the flawlessly managed interviews, the decades of precision performance. They talk about the moment when everything went wrong and Carson laughed. There's something profound in that preference. We don't remember people for their control. We remember them for the moments when control fails and they reveal themselves anyway. Dick Cavett once observed that Carson was the most socially uncomfortable person he'd ever known. Documentary filmmaker Peter Jones said there was something unknowable about him. Henry Bushkin called him the second unhappiest person he'd ever met. All of them were describing the same thing, a man who built walls so high that he could no longer see over them himself. The marmoset, in its innocent need to mark territory, knocked down one of those walls. Not permanently, not completely, but enough for 8 million people to glimpse what existed behind the performance. A human being, capable of surprise, capable of embarrassment, capable of laughing at himself. Carson never spoke publicly about what the incident meant to him. He didn't have to. It's there in the tape, in that brief moment when his carefully constructed persona shatters and something real emerges. Here's what we don't say about Johnny Carson. He was lonely. We say he was private, we say he was reserved, we say he separated performer from person with admirable discipline. But loneliness is the cost of that separation. When you build a wall between who you are and who you pretend to be, you end up trapped on the wrong side, unable to remember which version is real. Carson studied his own performances obsessively. He watched himself on tape, looking for flaws, for moments of imperfection. What was he searching for? What did he hope to find? Perhaps he was looking for the same thing the audience saw in the Marmoset incident. Proof that underneath the performance, someone real still existed. The tragedy of Carson's life wasn't that he got peed on by a marmoset on television. The tragedy was that it took something that absurd, that uncontrollable, to make him laugh with genuine joy. He spent 30 years as America's most beloved host, and the moment people remember most fondly is the moment when he lost control entirely. What does that tell us about control, about performance, about the masks we wear? In 1992, Carson retired from The Tonight Show. He gave a farewell address that was measured, graceful, perfectly calibrated. He thanked the audience, he thanked his staff. He maintained his composure until the very end. Then he disappeared. No interviews, no special appearances, no retrospectives. "I want to let the work speak for itself," he said. But the work that speaks loudest isn't the prepared material, the scripted monologues, the planned segments. It's the unplanned moment when a creature the size of a hand climbed onto his head and reminded him and 8 million viewers that life is fundamentally uncontrollable. Carson died in 2005 at 79 from emphysema. By then, he had spent 13 years away from television, living the private life he always wanted, on his boat, in his home, away from cameras. The Marmoset, whose name no one remembers if it even had one, lived perhaps 15 years in captivity. It's gone now too, returned to whatever comes after, having played its small part in television history. What remains is the tape, the footage, the moment. And in that moment, if you watch closely, you can see something remarkable. Johnny Carson, for perhaps the only time in his career, forgets to perform. He simply exists, surprised, wet, laughing, human. The industry learned nothing from the Marmoset incident. Television became more controlled, more managed, more carefully produced. Reality shows pretended to be spontaneous while following scripts. Late-night hosts refined Carson's techniques, studied his methods, but missed the essential truth. The moments audiences remember are the ones that slip through the preparation. Joan Embery continued appearing on talk shows for years, bringing animals, educating audiences. She never brought another Marmoset. Ed McMahon would tell the story at parties, always leading to the same conclusion. "That's when I knew Johnny was the best in the business." Anyone else would have panicked. Johnny just laughed. But was it the laughter of a man enjoying the moment, or the laughter of a man recognizing defeat? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that's what made it genuine. The studio is empty now. The lights are off. The cameras are cold. Somewhere in an archive, the tape sits in temperature-controlled storage. The Marmoset incident, preserved forever, ready to be played again whenever someone wants to remember when Johnny Carson was surprised into being human. The thing about that moment, the thing that makes it matter, isn't the absurdity of the situation. It's what came after. For the rest of that episode, Carson was different. Looser, more willing to take risks, as if the Marmoset had given him permission to stop protecting himself quite so fiercely. It didn't last. By the next episode, the walls were back in place, the separation restored, the performer and the person safely divided again. But for 90 seconds on a February evening in 1977, Johnny Carson forgot to be Johnny Carson. And America loved him for it. The question that remains, the question that sits in the silence after the laughter fades, is whether he ever loved himself that way. Whether he ever allowed himself to be surprised without cameras watching. Whether he ever let the walls come down in private. We'll never know. All we have is the tape, the moment, the tiny creature climbing onto his head, and the look on his face when he realized that all his preparation, all his control, all his careful architecture couldn't protect him from the simple, absurd, undeniable truth. Life happens anyway.